Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard P. Rumelt. Picture this. It's 1805, somewhere off the Spanish coast. Two massive fleets are about to collide in a battle that will reshape Europe's destiny. Napoleon, fresh off conquering most of the continent, has one prize left on his shopping list: England. But there's a small problem standing between him and that conquest: the legendary British Royal Navy. The French and Spanish have assembled an absolute monster of a fleet, 33 colossal warships. Facing them? Just 27 British vessels, commanded by a guy named Admiral Lord Nelson. Now, here's the thing about naval warfare back then. It was almost polite, civilized even. Both fleets would line up like dancers at a ball, form nice parallel lines, and sail past each other trading cannon fire. It was basically a test of who had more ships and could take more punishment. And on this particular day, the math wasn't looking great for Nelson. But Nelson? He wasn't interested in playing by the rules. He had something else in mind, an actual strategy. Instead of lining up like everyone expected, he did something absolutely bonkers. He split his fleet into two columns and aimed them like arrows straight at the enemy line, hitting them at a right angle. Now this sounds suicidal, right? His lead ships would be sitting ducks, absorbing devastating fire without being able to shoot back. But here's where Nelson's genius kicks in. He'd noticed something crucial. The ocean was rough that day, really rough. And he bet everything on a simple insight. Those less experienced French and Spanish gunners wouldn't be able to aim worth a damn in those heavy swells. He was gambling on a hidden weakness. His plan wasn't to trade shots like gentlemen. It was to smash their formation to pieces, turn their orderly battle into absolute chaos, and then trust his more skilled captains to win the street fight that followed. And you know what? He nailed it. When the smoke cleared at Trafalgar, the French and Spanish had lost 22 ships. The British? 0. Nelson himself took a fatal bullet, but his strategy had just saved England and locked in British naval supremacy for the next century and a half. That, right there, that's what real strategy looks like. It's not some bloated 50-page document. It's not a fluffy mission statement that sounds impressive in a boardroom. It's a clear, smart response to a genuine challenge that uses a key insight to punch way above its weight. And yet, if you look around today, in business, in government, even in how we plan our own lives, most of what people call strategy looks nothing like what Nelson did. We're drowning in what legendary strategist Richard Rumelt calls bad strategy. In his game-changing book, Good Strategy/Bad Strategy, Rumelt becomes our guide through this mess. He's like that wise mentor who cuts through all the corporate nonsense and motivational fluff to show us a surprisingly simple truth. Good strategy is rare, incredibly powerful, and often catches you off guard. And bad strategy? It's not just not good strategy. It's actually its own disease with symptoms we can all learn to spot. By the time we're done here today, you'll have a completely new way of seeing the world. You'll be able to smell bad strategy from a mile away, whether it's hiding in a company's annual report, a politician's speech, or even your own plans for the future. And more importantly, you'll understand what makes good strategy actually work. This isn't just business school stuff. This is about learning how to think with real clarity and power. Have you ever been in a meeting where someone unveils the company's shiny new strategy, and it's basically just a word salad of buzzwords and vague aspirations? Something like, our strategy is to achieve global leadership through synergistic growth and customer-centric innovation. Everyone around the table nods thoughtfully, but you're sitting there thinking, okay, but what does that actually mean? What are we supposed to do on Monday morning? If you've experienced that sinking feeling, congratulations. You've witnessed firsthand what Richard Rumelt has spent his career studying, the epidemic of bad strategy. Rumelt argues we've become so numb to strategy as cheerleading that we don't even notice anymore. A leader throws out some inspiring slogans, announces some ambitious targets. Maybe everyone does a trust fall at a corporate retreat, and boom, That's called a strategy. Except it's not. It's an emperor with no clothes. And this isn't just annoying, it's genuinely destructive. Bad strategy wastes resources, creates confusion, and actively blocks real progress. To fight it, Rumelt says, we first need to recognize it. And he gives us 4 crystal clear warning signs that what you're looking at is bad strategy. The first and most widespread symptom, fluff. Fluff is basically nonsense dressed up as strategic thinking. It uses fancy, unnecessarily complicated language to create the illusion of deep insight. Rumelt shares a perfect example from a major bank whose strategy document proclaimed, "Our fundamental strategy is one of customer-centric intermediation." Let's unpack that. Intermediation is just a $10 word for what banks do. They take deposits and lend them out. And customer-centric is corporate speak that supposedly means focusing on customers, but the bank had 0 specific policies that made them any more customer-focused than their competitors. So if you strip away all that verbal gift wrap, the statement actually says, our bank's fundamental strategy is to be a bank. It's completely circular and totally useless. It provides 0 guidance. It defines no action. It's pure, unadulterated fluff. And once you start looking for it, you'll see it absolutely everywhere. The second warning sign of bad strategy is failure to face the challenge. Here's the thing. Strategy is all about dealing with a challenge, an obstacle, a real problem. If you haven't clearly identified what that challenge is, you can't possibly have a good strategy. You just have a wish list written to Santa. Rumelt tells the story of International Harvester, once a massive American corporation. In 1979, they produced this thick, impressive-looking corporate strategic plan, full of beautiful graphs showing massive growth in revenue and profit. The plan was detailed, covering every division, talking about increasing market share and cutting costs. But the plan completely ignored the giant elephant doing the Macarena in the middle of the room. Harvester had the worst labor relations in American industry. Their work rules were so inefficient that their profit margins were half what their competitors enjoyed. The plan didn't even mention this. It didn't diagnose the central problem strangling the company. And so, predictably, the company collapsed. After a catastrophic 6-month strike, it hemorrhaged billions of dollars, closed most of its plants, and laid off 85,000 workers. That strategic plan turned out to be about as useful as a screen door on a submarine, because it failed to confront the single biggest obstacle facing the company. If you don't define the challenge, you can't conquer it. This leads us directly to the third hallmark, mistaking goals for strategy. This might be the most common trap of all. A leader announces a big, bold goal and genuinely believes they've created a strategy, but they haven't. Imagine a football coach telling his team, "Our strategy is to win." That's not a strategy. That's the goal. The strategy is how you're going to win. Are you going to pound them with a relentless ground game until their defense is exhausted? Or run a lightning-fast, no-huddle offense to keep them dizzy and off balance? That's strategy. Rumelt shares the story of a CEO he calls Chad Logan, who proudly presented his company's, quote, 2020 plan. The goal was simple. Achieve 20% revenue growth and a 20% profit margin. When Rumelt asked him how he planned to achieve this, the CEO's answer was all about motivation. He quoted Jack Welch about reaching for the impossible and talked passionately about the will to win and pushing until we get there. This talk of one last push reminded Rumelt of something darker, the tragic generals of World War I, who sent hundreds of thousands of highly motivated young men charging directly into fortified machine gun positions at places like Passchendaele. Those soldiers weren't lacking in courage or motivation, they were lacking competent strategic leadership. Motivation is absolutely vital, but it's not a substitute for strategy. Your job as a leader, or even just as a person trying to achieve something difficult, isn't just to want it really, really badly. It's to create the conditions that make your effort actually effective. Setting a goal isn't strategy. Strategy is the path you carve out to reach that goal. The final warning sign is bad strategic objectives. A strategic objective isn't your final destination. It's a key milestone along the way. But these objectives can go wrong in two main ways. First, you can have what Rumelt calls a dog's dinner of objectives, a messy, incoherent jumble of everything everyone wants to do. He mentions a small city whose strategic plan contained 47 strategies and 178 action items. Action item number 122 was literally, quote, "create a strategic plan." It's almost funny, except it's tragically common. A long list isn't a strategy. It's a sign that leadership has completely failed to make the hard choices about what truly matters. The second type of bad objective is the blue sky objective. This is a goal that's so unrealistic, so disconnected from the actual constraints you face, that it's basically just wishful thinking. Rumelt points to the Los Angeles Unified School District's plan to, quote, "build transformational leaders in its weakest schools." This sounds wonderful and inspiring, but there was no realistic plan for how to achieve it, especially when those schools were trapped inside a massive, controlling bureaucracy. A good strategy builds an actual bridge from where you are to where you want to be. A blue sky objective just points at the destination and pretends the canyon in between doesn't exist. So if bad strategy is this common and this easy to spot once you know what to look for, why on earth is there so much of it? Rumelt suggests a few powerful reasons. The biggest one is simple but painful: the unwillingness to choose. Strategy is fundamentally about focus, and focus means choosing what not to do. It means setting aside some goals, some interests, some people's pet projects in favor of others. And that's really, really hard. It's politically difficult and emotionally draining. Rumelt tells the story of sitting in a strategy meeting at Digital Equipment Corporation (DEC) in the early 90s. The company was in a death spiral, losing ground to the new personal computers flooding the market. The executives were split into camps. One group wanted to stick with what they knew, building integrated computer systems, the boxes strategy. Another group believed the future was in customer service and consulting, the solutions strategy. And a third group argued that semiconductor technology was the only thing that mattered, the chip strategy. They couldn't agree. Each path required massive, risky transformation, so instead of making a hard choice, they compromised. They crafted a fluffy, meaningless mission statement that said something like, "DEC is committed to providing high-quality products and services." It was designed to offend no one, and it helped no one. They avoided the choice, and within a few years, the company vanished, swallowed by a competitor. Universal agreement often means no real choice has been made. Another reason for bad strategy is what Rumelt calls the siren song of template-style strategy. You've definitely seen this. It's the fill-in-the-blanks approach. Our vision is blank. Our mission is blank. Our values are blank. This has become a massive industry for consultants because it's easy and it feels like you're doing something strategic. But it almost always produces generic, useless statements. Cornell University's mission, for example, is to educate leaders and extend knowledge. In other words, its mission is to be a university. This provides absolutely zero guidance. It's trying to bottle charisma, a bureaucratic attempt to replicate the magic of real vision without doing any of the actual hard work of real strategy. So after all this diagnosis of what's wrong, what does good strategy actually look like? If bad strategy is a complex disease, good strategy is shockingly simple in its structure. Rumelt says that every good strategy has a basic underlying logic he calls the kernel. And this kernel has exactly three parts: a diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent action. It all starts with the diagnosis. A good diagnosis simplifies the overwhelming complexity of reality and defines what the challenge really is. It answers the fundamental question, what's actually going on here? It's not a goal or a wish. It's a judgment about the critical factors in your situation. Think about Starbucks in 2008, when its growth suddenly stalled. One executive might diagnose the problem as market saturation. We've simply opened too many stores. Another might see it as eroding competitive advantage. McDonald's and Dunkin' have finally figured out how to make decent coffee. A third might diagnose it as failure to manage Wall Street's expectations. None of these are provably correct, but here's the thing. Each diagnosis points in a completely different strategic direction. The diagnosis you choose frames the entire problem. Once you have a diagnosis, you need a guiding policy. The guiding policy is your overall approach for dealing with the challenge you've just diagnosed. It's not a detailed list of every action you'll take. It's more like a signpost that points in a general direction. It rules out a huge array of other possible actions, creating focus. When Lou Gerstner took over a failing IBM in 1993, the prevailing diagnosis was that the company was too big and too integrated, and it needed to be broken up to match the newly fragmented computer industry. But Gerstner came up with a completely different diagnosis. He believed that in a world where everything was becoming specialized and fragmented, IBM's unique ability to understand all the pieces and make them work together was actually a massive strength, not a weakness. So his guiding policy became, leverage IBM's broad expertise to offer customers complete, tailored solutions to their complex information problems. He shifted the company's entire focus from selling hardware boxes to providing IT consulting and integration services. This guiding policy didn't spell out every single action, but it set a clear, powerful direction that changed everything. Finally, the kernel requires coherent action. This is where strategy meets reality. These are the specific, feasible, coordinated steps, policies, and resource commitments designed to carry out your guiding policy. The critical word here is coherent. The actions must work together, reinforcing each other to create a concentrated punch. Rumelt points to Ford in the late 90s as a cautionary example of incoherent action. CEO Jacques Nasser had a guiding policy of building a portfolio of premium brands, so he spent billions acquiring Volvo, Jaguar, and Land Rover. But at the exact same time, the company's old policy of achieving economies of scale was still driving decisions, so they took action to put Jaguar and Volvo on a common shared platform to save money. This was a disaster. Volvo buyers don't want a safe Jaguar, and Jaguar buyers definitely don't want a sporty Volvo. The actions were in direct conflict with each other, diluting and damaging the very brands they had paid billions to acquire. For a simpler, more positive example, Rumelt tells the story of his friend Stephanie, who owns a small corner grocery store. She's facing hundreds of potential choices. Should she lower prices to compete, stock organic produce, stay open later, add a deli counter? It's completely overwhelming. Her diagnosis, the core challenge, is competing with the giant 24/7 supermarket down the street. Her guiding policy, instead of trying to beat them on price or selection, battles she can't win, she'll focus on serving the busy professional who has little time to cook. Her coherent actions, she adds a second checkout stand to handle the 5-page M-rush better. She starts stocking high-quality, ready-to-eat meals. And she decides she doesn't need to stay open until midnight, because her target customers aren't shopping then anyway. Each action supports and reinforces the others, creating a focused, coherent strategy that gives her a real advantage in her chosen niche. That's the kernel. Diagnosis, guiding policy, coherent action. It's the fundamental logic of every good strategy, whether you're running a corner store or commanding a navy. So you understand the basic structure of good strategy, but where does its real knockout power come from? How do you create that devastating punch that Nelson delivered at Trafalgar, or that Steve Jobs used to resurrect Apple from near death? Rumelt says it comes from finding and exploiting what he calls sources of power. One of the most fundamental sources is leverage. Leverage is about concentrating your energy on a pivotal point where a relatively small push will create a cascade of favorable outcomes. It's about finding the keystone in the arch, the one stone that, if removed or pushed, brings everything else down or up. Rumelt says this comes from a potent mixture of anticipation, insight, and concentration. For instance, consider anticipation. While American car companies were going all in on SUVs in the 90s, making huge profits, Toyota was quietly investing over $1 billion developing hybrid technology. Why? They anticipated that eventually, maybe not this year or next, but eventually, fuel economy pressures would become a massive force shaping the market. They were skating to where the puck was going to be, not where it was. Then there are pivot points, natural imbalances in a situation you can exploit. In Japan, 7-Eleven's leadership noticed something interesting. Japanese consumers are absolutely obsessed with newness and variety, even in mundane things like snacks. So they built their entire strategy around pressing on this insight. They created a system of quick response teams, working with small food manufacturers to rapidly bring new, private label snacks and ready-to-eat meals to market, constantly refreshing their offerings. They found a pivot point in consumer psychology and built an entire machine designed to press on it relentlessly. Another incredibly powerful concept Rumelt gives us is the proximate objective. A leader's most important job, he argues, is to absorb all the massive complexity and ambiguity of a situation and hand the organization a simpler problem, one it can actually solve. That solvable problem is the proximate objective. It's a target that's close enough and clear enough to be feasible. The most famous example is President Kennedy's 1961 pledge to put a man on the moon and return him safely by the end of the decade. We often remember this as a bold, almost reckless dream, but Rumelt reveals it was actually a brilliant and carefully chosen proximate objective. At the time, the U.S. was getting absolutely crushed in the space race. The Soviets had a huge lead in heavy-lift rocket technology. They could easily win a race to build a space station or land an unmanned probe on the moon. But Kennedy's top scientist, Wernher von Braun, gave him crucial advice. A manned moon landing would require an entirely new generation of much larger rockets that neither side currently possessed. In a race that started from scratch, America's larger economy and deeper resource base would be decisive advantages. So the moon landing wasn't some impossible dream. It was actually the one race America had an excellent chance of winning. It was a feasible, strategic, carefully chosen proximate objective that focused the nation's energy for an entire decade. For a more down-to-earth example, Rumelt shares a story from his own youth as a young engineer at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, working on the Surveyor unmanned moonlander. The engineering teams were completely stuck. Nobody knew what the moon's surface was actually like. Was it soft powder that would swallow a lander? Sharp crystals that would puncture it? A chaotic jumble of boulders? You simply can't design a landing craft if you don't know what you're landing on. The project was deadlocked until a manager named Phyllis Bawalda did something brilliant. She wrote a specification that defined the lunar surface as hard, grainy, with gentle slopes and scattered small rocks, basically like the southwestern desert. Did she actually know this was true? No, nobody did. But as she wisely explained, the engineers couldn't work without a specification. And if the moon turned out to be dramatically more difficult than that, then the entire program of landing a man there was probably doomed anyway. Her specification wasn't the truth, it was a proximate objective. It absorbed the crippling ambiguity of the situation and gave the engineers a concrete problem they actually knew how to solve. And they did solve it. Surveyors successfully landed on a surface that, as it turned out, looked remarkably like Phyllis's desert specification. A third source of strategic power comes from understanding chain link systems. A system has chain link logic when its overall performance is completely limited by its weakest link. The Space Shuttle Challenger is a heartbreaking example. Its weakest link turned out to be a simple rubber O-ring that failed in cold temperatures. It didn't matter how sophisticated the guidance systems were or how powerful the rocket boosters were. In a chain, you're only as strong as your weakest link, and strengthening all the other links doesn't make the chain any stronger at all. This logic explains why so many organizations get hopelessly stuck. Think about General Motors during its long decline. Improving the quality of the transmission didn't help much if the interior knobs were still falling off. A department manager responsible for transmissions had very little incentive to invest millions in improvements if the design department was still churning out bland, uninspiring cars and the assembly quality was still sloppy. The whole system gets trapped in a state of mediocre performance because improving just one link doesn't deliver any payoff. But here's the fascinating flip side. This same brutal logic also explains sustained excellence. Think about IKEA. Its success comes from a tightly integrated chain of mutually reinforcing policies. It has giant suburban stores with massive parking lots. It uses catalogs instead of expensive sales staff. It designs its own ready-to-assemble, flat-pack furniture in-house. And customers pull their own items from the warehouse and transport them home themselves. A competitor can't just copy one piece of this puzzle. A traditional furniture store that starts selling some flat-pack furniture won't magically transform into IKEA. They'd still have the wrong store locations, the wrong cost structure, and no in-house design capability. To truly compete, a rival would have to replicate the entire chain-linked system simultaneously, which is incredibly difficult and expensive. IKEA's excellence is protected precisely because its strategy is a coherent, tightly linked whole. You can't cherry-pick just the good parts. Perhaps the most classic source of strategic power is using advantage, bringing a relative strength to bear against a relative weakness. The biblical story of David and Goliath isn't just an inspiring tale of courage. It's actually a masterclass in strategy. Goliath's apparent strengths, his enormous size, heavy armor, and massive spear, were all designed for close quarters hand-to-hand combat. But David flat-out refused to fight that fight. By choosing a shepherd's sling as his weapon, he completely redefined the battlefield. Suddenly, Goliath's armor became a weakness. It was heavy, slowing him down, and it didn't protect the one vulnerable spot on his forehead. David's weapon delivered precise, devastating force from a distance, completely neutralizing all of Goliath's supposed advantages. The story teaches us that advantage isn't absolute. It's about seeing a situation from a fresh perspective that reveals a decisive asymmetry. This is exactly what Sam Walton did in building Walmart. In the early days, the conventional wisdom in retail was ironclad. A big discount store needed a population of at least 100,000 people to be viable. Walton seemed to violate this rule by putting big stores in small towns with tiny populations. But Rumelt shows us that Walton didn't actually break the rule. He changed the game by redefining what a store meant. For competitors like Kmart, the basic unit of management was the individual store. Each store was its own little kingdom. But for Walton, the basic unit was the network. A regional distribution center serving 150 stores, all connected by a sophisticated, computerized logistics system. That network of 150 stores collectively served a population of millions. Walton's profound insight was to see retailing not as a collection of individual stores, but as an integrated logistical system, almost like a living organism. This hidden source of power was something Kmart, trapped in its old way of thinking, could simply never replicate. Finally, some of the most powerful strategies of all don't come from creating an advantage from scratch, but from riding a wave of change. Major waves of change, fundamental shifts in technology, regulation, or consumer behavior, are like earthquakes. They create new high ground and level old high ground. A brilliant strategist sees the wave forming early, understands where it's heading, and channels resources to occupy the positions that will become valuable and defensible as the new landscape settles into place. The story of Cisco Systems is a textbook example. In the 80s and early 90s, the computer and telecommunications industries were dominated by giants like IBM and AT&T. Their power came from enormous scale and billion-dollar development projects. Then, a series of waves began rolling through the industry. First, there was the rise of the microprocessor, which meant that a product's performance was increasingly determined not by custom-built hardware, but by clever software, written by small, nimble teams. Second, corporations were starting to build internal data networks to connect their various computers and systems. And third, A free vendor-neutral networking standard called IP Internet Protocol was quietly gaining traction. Cisco, a tiny startup at the time, didn't create any of these waves, but its leaders saw them coming and positioned themselves perfectly to ride them, while giants like IBM were desperately defending their own proprietary network protocols. Cisco built routers that could handle everyone's protocols, with special emphasis on the rising IP standard. Then the fourth and biggest wave hit, the explosion of the public internet in the mid-90s. Suddenly, every corporation on Earth needed to connect to the internet. IP became the utterly dominant standard, and Cisco was sitting there perfectly positioned with exactly the right product at exactly the right moment. They harnessed the raw power of these massive external changes and rode them straight to the top. So how do you actually develop this kind of strategic mind? How do you learn to see the world the way Rumelt does, or Nelson, or Steve Jobs? Rumelt's final, and perhaps most profound lesson, is that you must learn to think about your own thinking. The crucial first step is understanding that strategy is a hypothesis. When Rumelt was consulting with a group of brilliant engineers at Hughes Electronics, they became increasingly frustrated. They were used to a world of certainty, of precise calculations and meticulous planning. This whole strategy stuff seemed frustratingly vague and unscientific to them. Rumelt responded with a powerful analogy. He told them that a good strategy is exactly like a good scientific hypothesis. A scientist doesn't deduce a revolutionary new theory purely from what's already known. They make an inductive leap, an educated guess about how things might work at the edge of current knowledge. Then they test that hypothesis through careful experimentation. Strategy works the same way. It's your best educated guess about what will work in a complex, uncertain, constantly changing situation. The implementation is your experiment. And as the results start coming in, you learn, you adapt, and you continuously refine your hypothesis. Howard Schultz at Starbucks is the perfect illustration. His initial hypothesis was that he could faithfully replicate the authentic Italian espresso bar experience in America. His first experimental store quickly showed that hypothesis was flawed. Americans didn't want to stand at a bar listening to opera. They wanted comfortable chairs, non-fat milk in their lattes, and big paper cups they could take with them on the go. Schultz became a great strategist not because his first idea was perfect and brilliant, but because he paid extremely close attention to the results of his experiment and was willing to continuously adjust his strategy based on what he actually learned from real customers. The final challenge, and perhaps the greatest one, is learning to keep your head when everyone around you is losing theirs. Good strategy requires fiercely independent judgment, but the psychological pull of the crowd, of social herding, is incredibly powerful and dangerous. Rumelt uses the spectacular rise and catastrophic fall of Global Crossing to illustrate this danger. In the late 90s, the company was building a private fiber-optic telecommunications cable across the Atlantic, and the stock market absolutely loved it. The narrative was intoxicating. The internet was exploding, traffic was doubling every year, and there would soon be an agonizing choke point for undersea cable capacity. Global Crossing's stock price soared to absurd heights, making it worth more than the entire Ford Motor Company. But Rumelt and his MBA students did something simple. They performed a basic, fundamental industry analysis, the kind of thing taught in the very first week of any strategy course. And what they saw was absolutely terrifying. Transatlantic cable capacity was becoming a perfect commodity market. The technology wasn't proprietary or special. New competitors were rushing into the space. And rapid technological advances meant the cost of adding new capacity was plummeting fast. A massive oversupply and inevitable price collapse were virtually guaranteed. It was one of the worst possible industry structures imaginable for making money. Yet when a student nervously pointed out that the stock market was saying the exact opposite, valuing the company at astronomical levels, everyone paused. The market had spoken. The experts, the Wall Street analysts, the high-priced consultants, they were all caught up in the hysteria, abandoning their own independent judgment to follow the crowd. And, of course, the inevitable crash came. Capacity exploded, prices collapsed into the basement, and Global Crossing went bankrupt. The fundamental analysis had been absolutely right. The market, caught up in groupthink, had been spectacularly wrong. The lesson is timeless and sobering. A true strategist must have the courage to trust their own rigorous analysis of the fundamentals, especially when the crowd is loudly chanting the opposite. When you finish reading a book like Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, you feel like someone just handed you a new pair of prescription glasses. The world, which had seemed blurry and overwhelmingly complex, suddenly snaps into sharp, clear focus. Richard Rumelt's most powerful gift to readers isn't some complicated framework or secret formula. It's the profound and genuinely liberating clarity of the kernel. This elegant idea that a real strategy is simply a diagnosis, a guiding policy, and coherent action slices through decades of accumulated corporate jargon and motivational fluff like a hot knife through butter. It's fundamentally a tool for clearer thinking. It tells us that strategy isn't about creating a perfect 100-page strategic plan that nobody reads. It's not about crafting a poetic, inspirational vision statement that sounds great framed on a wall. It's about honesty, being brutally honest in your diagnosis of the real challenge you're actually facing, not the challenge you wish you were facing. It's about courage, having the guts to make genuinely hard choices and adopt a guiding policy that truly focuses your limited energy and resources. And it's about discipline, the craftsmanship required to design coherent actions that all pull powerfully in the same direction, instead of canceling each other out. In a world that constantly rewards quick answers, wishful thinking, and blindly following the herd, this kind of clear, rigorous, logical thinking becomes an absolute superpower. And what's truly beautiful about Rumelt's framework is that it applies to absolutely everything, not just billion-dollar corporations and military campaigns. Think about your own life right now, today. Maybe you're a student feeling completely overwhelmed by competing demands. Maybe you're an athlete, desperately trying to make the team. Maybe you're an artist struggling to finish an important project. You can apply the kernel right this moment. What is the single biggest challenge actually holding you back? Not 10 things. Find the one critical obstacle that matters most. That's your diagnosis. What's your overall approach to overcoming it? Not a random to-do list, but a guiding principle. Maybe it's, I will focus on consistency over intensity, or I will master the fundamentals thoroughly before attempting advanced techniques. That's your guiding policy. Finally, what are 2 or 3 specific, coordinated actions that will bring that policy to life? Not a scattered list of everything you might do, but a tight set of actions that genuinely support and reinforce one another. Those are your coherent actions. This surprisingly simple exercise can transform that vague, anxious feeling of being stuck into a clear, concrete path forward. It replaces paralyzing anxiety with genuine agency and power. That's precisely why this book matters so much. It reminds us that strategy isn't the exclusive domain of expensive consultants or CEOs in corner offices. It's a fundamental human skill, available to anyone willing to think clearly. It's the timeless art of identifying a meaningful challenge and creating a coherent way to overcome it. Good strategy is genuinely rare, which is exactly why it's so devastatingly powerful. And by learning to see the stark difference between the real thing and the cheap imitation, you're already halfway to mastering it yourself. That was the core of Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rumelt. We've explored the smoke-filled battlefields of Trafalgar, walked the halls of Apple alongside Steve Jobs, and seen how a simple corner grocery store can outsmart a giant supermarket chain. But this summary is just the map. The real treasure is waiting in the book itself. If any of these stories sparked something inside you, if you felt even a small jolt of clarity or recognition, I genuinely encourage you to pick up a copy and dive in deeper. Reading it isn't just about learning strategy in the abstract. It's about fundamentally learning how to think with more power, clarity, and purpose in everything you do. The link is waiting for you in the description. Also, if this journey gave you a fresh perspective today, do me a small favor and hit that like button and subscribe. It tells me we're heading in the right direction together, and make sure you won't miss our next deep dive into another world-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Thank you so much for listening, and let's keep learning and growing together.